the whole bad seeds thing started for me from a girlfriend. I was a little late having Nick come into my life. Um, I think it was around this time of the Good Son album, and I had this horribly neurotic girlfriend who was a member of like 19 different anonymous groups, every one you could think of, and she championed this guy's tortured songs to me.
When The Good Son came out, I at that point I was, had really sort of gotten into Tender Prey and the sort of aesthetic and sound behind it, and I hated The Good Son for like, I don't know, the first few months I had it because it was so different, and it was just so. It just felt, it's a different band.
This was a record that Nick wrote a lot in London in between the time of touring and recording.
After sort of getting past that sort of, I guess, sort of teenage rebellious expectation, I realized that it's actually a incredibly beautiful and powerful record. And at the same time, it was just a total evolvement from the last record. It's just, they just topped themselves and just raised the bar.
I listened to the first song, and there was a majesty about it, and I couldn't even. I mean, to this day, I don't know. Those. I believe the Portuguese, but the lyrics. I know they have something to do with Jesus because there's Jesus in them, but I still don't know what they are. But they just had a magnificent sound to them, and then they were counterpointed with this beautiful love lyrics of a relationship and dissolution and regret and things like that. And I knew right away from hearing that song that this guy was a keeper.
Foi na cruz. Foi na cruz. I feel like Charo from The Love Boat. I love that song. It's so peaceful. What an interesting way to start an album. It's just a really lovely, peaceful, beautiful song.
For the first time ever, because, and I've lived with that album for what, 18 years or something. I bothered to get a translation of the lyrics to Foi na Cruz.
It wasn't a cross that one day I saw my sins in Jesus. It wasn't a cross. That's what it means.
He really wanted this lullaby type of singing with the Brazilian singers they brought in, and he was very, very much. He was very sure of the way it was going to go. And I remember the singers really wanted it to go differently because it was a language thing, but he had a song consideration. And I remember they were like, oh, we'll just act like we're dead then. Because I guess there was not, in the way he wanted them to sing it, they were saying there wasn't enough, pathos in it or something.
I think he was really interested in Brazilian culture, but in that kind of sense, in the sort of religious culture and hymns, and very impressed by the how passionate it is portrayed, images of Jesus and the church, how sort of quite dramatic the church side in Brazil.
The shift of sound, actually, we had gone there to tour, and Nick fell in love with Brazil.
Nick fell in love with a nice Brazilian woman and decided to stay there.
That was good. The recording in Sao Paulo was bizarre. At that time, we all, I gave up smoking cigarettes about 10 years ago, but at that time we were all still smoking cigarettes. And these people were trying to protect their heavy investment in equipment, etc. So you were not allowed to smoke in the studio.
The choice of studio is the principal decision you make, and it wasn't the ideal studio in Brazil. And in fact, the record company there were based in Sao Paulo, and they wanted us to work there so that they could keep an eye on us, and we didn't kind of end up, getting mugged every day or something, whatever the hell they were trying to protect there, I don't know. But all the good studios, as it turned out, were actually in Rio. So we should have been working in Rio, but instead we were in this studio that was kind of like an advertising studio. And it was okay, but it wasn't the ideal studio for us.
You were not just that, you were not allowed to drink in the studio either, because they were afraid that you could spill a drink and it would be, run into the mixing desk or something like that. So I had to set up a little table between the doors, between the door where you come in and the door where you're actually inside. And it was allowed for me to have that door open so that I can actually hear the music while sitting there drinking and smoking. But I was not allowed to make one step to the left and go inside the recording studio. That was weird.
My little brother, I'm 6'6", so actually my little brother is, now that he's grown up, he's not very little at all, but he's still my little brother. He would hear the bad seeds in his father, my stepfather's car. His dad would play The Good Son, the album, quite a lot, I think, on cassette. And he was sitting in the front room with him. He was about 4 or 5, I think. And he just started singing, "One more man gone, one more man gone," because for him it had the immediacy, the simplicity of a nursery rhyme.
This young fellow trying to get the attention of his family and, it falling on deaf ears because they're busy dealing with their truant other son, his brother.
And he had the little plastic toy guitar with 4 strings on it. So, I knew what to do with them and kind of detune them down so they're all in a single open chord. I wish I had the cassette of this. I was trying to find it. But I've got it somewhere. And Alex, bless him, just started strumming at the end of every phrase. And there he was like our own little baby Blixerbargeld.
There's a sort of sense of fatalism. It's not really fatalism, because it's a sort of reversal, seems to be a reversal of the Cain and Abel story.
Some people might think, it's about Cain and Abel or something like that. No way. It's about Dallas. The good son is Bobby Ewing, and the bad son obviously is JR. And of course he worships his mother and he worships his father, and he does his best to keep Ewing oil going. He's the good son, but he curses that because he's always got to pull out all the stops and fix everything that JR mucks up with his crooked deals. That's what I reckon that's about.
It's about the kind of the futility of trying to be good. It's a racked parable. It makes me think of my little brother when he was a little boy, how much I love him.
About a year after I bought The Weeping Song, I was reading some Shauna Casey. This is him writing in 1939, writing his memoirs of growing up in rural Ireland in, the very end of Queen Victoria's reign. And he's talking about the kids in the street all forming a circle for this game they used to play. One of the girls would get in the middle of the circle and she would pretend to be weeping. And the people in the circle would sing. And here's what they're singing. They're singing, "Poor Jenny is a weeping, a weeping, a weeping. Poor Jenny's a weeping on a bright summer's day. Pray tell us what you're weeping for, a weeping for, a weeping for. Pray tell us what you're weeping for on a bright summer's day."
What are they all crying about? Well, it appears they're crying because it's a vale of tears. There's no specific reason given.
Well, I'm not actually 100% sure. Everyone's interpretation is open, but the sound, it had like these vibes in the beginning that lead off the song, and just it had like the texture. I'm not necessarily an analyst of music. I just go with the feel.
It's drawing on bits of old folk tunes. I mean, that's not the same, but it's similar, and I like that.
Coming from a Greek background and the women weeping. I know when there's death or tragedy in our lives, in that sort of Southern European background, it's okay to cry and to weep and to howl.
The fullness of emotion that is brought to these non-specific words is very, very effective technique, I found.
He wanted me to sing the father in that, and he wanted to be the son in that. And I always very much enjoyed singing that song.
And I remember him being really nervous about it, but then getting into the spirit of it. And after a while, Nick's going, turn his voice down. His voice sounds loads better than mine, you know.
Like in the Weeping song, they seem to be having so much fun together. I mean, these two strong personalities, and very often strong personalities clash. They don't want strong personalities around. But that was another special thing back then. It was so many strong personalities, and nobody was a threat to anybody else. Everybody was just, wow, you're so good. Let's do something together. And it was kind of like being in a boat with hundreds of captains. And everybody was like the leader, and everybody was following the leader, but everybody was the leader. So it was an amazing experience.
You know, I didn't, when I first came across Nick Cave, I didn't know Nick Cave. I was living in Europe. I was probably 15, between 13 and 15, obsessed with MTV, which was the European MTV, so it was kind of a different thing. But I think that they had an equivalent of 120 minutes or some kind of programs, probably pre-Beavis and Butthead, that did show good music. And they would have like a 10-second promo spot where it was this guy in a boat, you know, on a fake ocean, and singing these lyrics, saying, "Father, why are all the women weeping?"
We originally tried to make that video in Greece, in a real little ship on the water. And the weather was really bad, and we couldn't do it. And they got us a whole case of Retsina, and they actually rented the boat, but it wasn't actually what Nick's idea of the little boat was more romantic than the reality of nowadays. So, and the weather it was impossible to do. It was crying out for a Fellinesque treatment of the idea.
And I just walked around for probably a few years with that one lyric in my head, "Father, why are all the women weeping?" in that kind of crazy baritone, almost like the track is slowed down delivery that he has in that song. And then the image of this guy in this fake paper boat on a fake ocean singing that just strange lyric in that strange way.
And it was very Fellinesque, as it was filmed by, I think, Angela Conway in the studio, with plastic plant playing the waves, and a moon being less a light bulb, and us being on like a truck. How do you call these things? Springs, and waving back and forth in a little wooden boat, drinking Retsina. And I can say for the record, we did drink Retsina there. We didn't drink water.
One of the things I've always loved about Nick and the music he makes with his bands is the kind of contradictions in the work. And there's a quote I've always loved by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then. I am enormous. I contain multitudes."
I never liked music that would make me feel like kind of crying over problems I had, or, you know, feeling like a misplaced teenager. If anything, I liked very kind of hardcore music and very tough music with anger coming out of it. But like punk music, for example, didn't represent me because it just had the anger. So Nick Cave's music to me has both these elements, and I found that in The Good Son, I finally found a record which had both in it.
Here is someone who can write and perform some incredibly hard, driving, dark, twisted, fucked up songs, and with incredibly heavy rhythms and just heavy sonic kind of experiences. And then we'll go into this incredible delicacy and tenderness and gentleness and beauty. And it's rare to have someone who can do both those things.
I remember quite vividly him writing the ship song. We were in a bar, sitting outdoors in this beautiful place in Brazil, by a harbor actually, and I just really was impressed the way he would just pull out his notebook just there and then and just write and not really need any sort of special sort of surroundings to sort of focus.
The ship song just is so evocative of love, and the sexual experience I feel through that song. You almost have Nick whispering in your ear when you're having a private moment at home.
Because that song is just one of the most sweeping romantic songs ever written.
There is something disarming about the way that song is sung, something just kind of so honest and so open.
And the scale of it, I love. Kind of makes you just, because when you fall in love, it's like suddenly kind of everything else falls away. And I think the words of that song are just magnificent in the kind of the epic scale upon which it kind of operates lyrically.
But there was one thing about the lyrics of that song that was only a few years ago, that I noticed that he says, I must remove your wings and you must try to fly.
That's the little boy pulling the wings off the fly. And it's just like, it's so mean and it's so dark. And yet it is such a romantic song.
It was so tender, really, that shockingly tender song in a way. And has always, I sing to myself at certain moments when I need to feel that kind of feeling.
It reminds me of a particular boyfriend who constantly said, it's just a song full of cliches, which it is. And every time I listen to it, I think of him and him saying that.
Life is cliches. You basically get to choose your cliches. There is no other way. You want to be a nonconformist? Then guess what? That's a cliche too, being a nonconformist. It's all cliche. That's all we have to go on. And they're cliches because they are actually true. It's like, so yes, it might be a song of cliches. By the same token, they all resonate, or at least they resonate with me, but they do resonate. We make a little history, baby, every time you come around. That's a great line.
There's real beauty in those, in the lines, the come sail your ships around me, burn all your bridges down.
We make a little history, baby, every time you come around. What a great encapsulation of what probably is a tortured relationship that we've all had. And we all keep going back and back. And we all kind of, say, well, I'm not going to do this again. I'm not going to do that again. But then, Nick will say, we talk about it all night long. We define our moral ground. But when I crawl into your arms, everything comes tumbling down.
That's it. We can talk for days about how morally secure and right we are. And yeah, that all means nothing.
I mean, I've always imagined it was another woman. It wasn't his girlfriend that he was writing that song to. So I've always felt that defining the moral ground bit is like going over and over old ground, trying to make it all right to be doing what they're doing.
There's a certain brutality about it. But it's, I think what's really interesting about it is actually the nature of their relationship, because it's almost like it's two people who maybe he's got someone else, they've got someone else, but they have this thing. I mean, and this is just one possible sort of way of looking at it. But they've got this thing that is so intense that they kind of. It's not that they can't let go of each other, but they won't let go of each other.
The intensity of that is in the ship song was in our relationship. And I didn't know that we would end up getting married or anything. I had no idea.
It's a sort of song that's played at a lot of people's weddings and things like that. It's such a beautifully simple song. And like, any great pop song, which it sort of is in a way, you sort of feel like you know it already, and the lyrics just stick in your head.
It's like a modern standard, if you can imagine that. I mean, people look at the Mercy Seat and because it was covered by Johnny Cash, but I think the Ship Song is his greatest song in terms of pure songwriting.
We once hadn't really seen them play the Ship Song live until we were at some gig at Brixton Academy, and we could only get seats upstairs. Who wants to sit down at a Bad Seed show? So we were sat there watching the band, and on came the Ship Song, and like shivers went up my spine. You know, that kind of thrill of like, oh, they're playing our song. And my hand sort of crept out, hoping to kind of catch Iain's, to sort of share this amazing moment, this acknowledgement. And then in the rows in front of us, all around, were boyfriends slipping their arms around their girlfriend. And it was this horrifying, cold realization of, fuck, this is everybody else's song as well.
And so what if 5,000 people are holding hands and singing along at the same time? I guess it makes you feel it's not so special for you, but maybe that's just why it's such a good song.
He always plays the Ship Song. And people love that. And I know it's one of his favourites, but there's the B-side called The Train Song, which I absolutely adore.
It should have been on the album, really. Absolutely gorgeous ballad. And I just think this new feel for songwriting and writing words he was going to turn this into an art.
If you hear the song, it's a succession of questions from the speaker. He's lost a woman. The woman has gone to him. And he's asking a listener questions about her departure. How long's the train been gone? Did she dye her hair? When did the whistle blow? And that's always sort of haunted me, that song, because it's about, number one, losing something or somebody very dear to you. But number two, it's about dealing with that. And what fascinates me about that song is that the protagonist has an almost masochistic or forensic interest in the circumstances of the loss of this woman. He's never going to see her again. He's missed on the last chance to ever see her again. So he's buttonholed somebody who has got nothing to do with him and nothing to do with his story. And he's repeatedly inquiring about what she looked like the last time this person saw her, which to me has always been very, very poignant.
It really, really got to me. Just that idea of that great, great yearning and longing, and that moment where you just feel that you've let a moment slip past you.
It's like when you hear of these terrible stories of people who somebody's dying and they're rushing to see them, like a parent, for example, or a loved one, and they miss their death. I mean, surely that would be dreadful. I mean, my father died a couple of years ago, and I was lucky enough, weird word to say, but I was fortunate enough to be there when he died. And it would have been terrible not to be there at the moment of his death. And in a way, I think that's what the train song says to me. He's missed it. She hasn't just got on a train and left. She's gone from his life. And all he can get now are these sort of fragments of what she was wearing and what time the train went. And he's going to live over them again and again in his mind.
And it just really stirred something in me and brought me to tears, still does, every time I hear that song.
I would guess that the Ship Song and the Weeping Song get most of the attention, but the Hammer Song, the third of the song trilogy, is a fantastic number as well.
It's a good, again, very traditional sort of blues or folk over the years. They really didn't mind calling something the something song, or just, I mean, how many people writing a blues song in the 20s or 30s? You know, they'd play the song in the studio, and then the studio engineer would say, so what that one's called? And he'd go, oh, it's called blah, 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 blues, whatever. It's just making up a title.
I guess with The Good Son, because it was Nick and I, and the others working, doing the demos, and I think they're the first demos they ever did. It was 2 weeks of him just working on the song and working on the song and working on the arrangement by himself. It was a slower process of it coming together. But, yet when the band played, they pretty much just played live to what was recorded in Berlin. And, it came together really quickly.
And this is, people are very surprised when they hear how quickly we work. I mean, after the basic tracks are recorded, we tend to tinker around for a bit with overdubbing and kind of experimenting a bit on top of what's there, and probably spend as much time. No, and we don't spend as much time mixing as most groups do. But the initial recording thing, if we've got 12 or 14 songs, they'll all be recorded by day 4.
They're fantastic musicians, and really 1 or 2 takes is enough, and that's it. There really isn't any labouring over a take. If it's not right in a couple of takes, well, so be it,
We've certainly learnt to rely on that and trust in that process, and in that way there's also a very... that's why we work quickly, and that's why we trust in the moment and capturing something special in that moment.
What I really like about Lament is that it really captures this sort of corruption and corruption blended with purity. That it seems to be a sort of strange mingling that occurs in Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds songs a lot of the time.
Everything about that song, the melody, and the way he wrote the lyrics, the way he repeat, it's kind of in a repetitive way, and the way he plays with the words.
Your trick of blood, the trap of fire, your ancient wound, your scarlet moon, and your fairground smile.
To this day, it's one of my favorite Nick Cave songs, and it's a love song, and it's about a love which has ended, but it's a very beautiful and peaceful song which just kind of gently says goodbye to the person he's written it for.
It's not necessarily an escape, but it's more like a sort of a refuge than an escape.
It's like a book of short stories that you just never, ever tire of. Every song I have visuals, the same visuals in my head that I go through every time.
It's always nice to have. I work in movies, and I cut music onto movies. So since I was a kid, long before I did that for a living, there's a soundtrack that runs in your head always. And there are songs. This is why I don't wear an iPod, is because I usually have a song running in my head that's just, I know them from start to finish, and it just plays in my head as I'm witnessing everything around me.
The Good Son just became an absolute, just an album that I played constantly. On my way to work, I lived in Islington, and I used to have to go down to an old warehouse in Wapping Wall, and it was just my soundtrack. Had that on one side, Scott Walker on the other side, and it was just like one on the way down, one on the way home, every day for possibly 2 years.
Whether knowingly or not, probably not, you put an onus on that album because of what was happening at the time, and it happened to be left there just for, out of laissez-faire. But now that album represents something. It's almost Pavlovian. There's certain songs that can take you to, it's like Proust said it better than I ever will. They're like smells that can take you to a certain place. There are songs that will immediately take, I can put on Brian Eno's Another Green World, and I am 14 again in Northern California. That's what happens. You're just there. You're suddenly just taken there. And that's the beauty and the power and, the danger of music.
Because you adopt the persona of whatever song is on. So if you're listening to Lucy, it might be a bit drifty and lovely, but melancholy. But if you're listening to the Witness song and you're fighting your way through the commuters, then you're really moving.
What I always liked about that song was the line, that gesture, it will haunt me, and this gesture, it will haunt me. She puts her hands to her face, and he doesn't say why, but the simple fact that he leans very heavily on that line actually gives you the whole context of the song somehow.
I don't even know what's going on in the song, but there's all this activity, all this frenetic energy and talking and background voices, and it is like some old musical play from, I don't know, from ancient Greece, where there's, these choruses and just all this stuff happening.
I didn't know much about his work then. I didn't know that Making the Good Son, it was such a mark, such a turning point in a way. Not that he then from then on just wrote really romantic ballad songs, but that people really were taken aback by it. And I kind of knew that in a way. I kind of knew that there was something more daring for him, more perhaps even a bit more mainstream. But there was that something very soft about Nick that he hadn't really shown before.
The way that the Bad Seeds write and Nick writes a love song that's just so steeped in reality just makes it so, it just connects so well. And I don't understand why sometimes, when you just, sometimes you're listening to something and you can't understand why any other songs exist, because Nick just writes them so perfectly, and the Bad Seeds just play them so perfectly.
I remember at the time thinking, wow, I barely did anything on that record, But then a few years later, I listened to it, or, more recently, and I thought, wow, I did great things on that record, and it's just very much more subtle. I was so used to like slashing and clanging and,
Yeah, Lucy is actually probably one of my favorite pieces of music in the whole world. Specifically, like the last half of that song is one of the most beautiful things I've heard.
It reminds me of what I want a relationship to be, in terms of I want to love somebody that much as Nick does in Lucy. As much as he loves Lucy, I want to love somebody that much.
It's just I'm not sure who's playing it. I don't know if it's Blix or Kid at the end, but there's just this very, very minimal and haunting guitar that plays on at the very end. It's like 2 or 3 notes, but it's just the right 2 or 3 notes.
There's a really, almost like a lifting of the heaviness that had been in the past that I'd known. And it was really, it was good fun. It was joyous. It was uplifting. He was having a great time listening to the stuff. And while we were doing that, ironically enough, that was when the Berlin Wall came down.
In the middle of the night, when we were still busy with that, in this like totally desolate area of West Berlin where nobody goes at night, where you would need 3 hours to find a cab, suddenly it was all full of people because the wall at the end of the street came down. This was actually the first opening of the wall at all, was the end of the studio street. So we first watched that on television in the studio, and then we watched out the window and figured out it is actually happening down there.
At that time, somebody phoned me up in the studio and said, "Hey man, the wall is down. The wall is down. You have to go out." Hey, because the studio was next to the wall. It was in Kreuzberg, just next to the wall. And we just said, we don't have time. Yeah, we have to work. No, let's just let them go in. And then we went out, and then when all these people came. Also, this I can remember from very special Berlin. Freedom, maybe.
So it was another, huge moment in history that is a really positive thing. And I think for some strange reason, it seems to reflect on that record.
It's something emotional about that LP that really got me, other than, the ones before. And it was like, that's a really deep record, It was like every single track was like just brilliant. And I think that's probably the one that's done it for me more than all the others, really. Because all the others were just like, I just listened to them and they were like, cool, I just know the people playing on the music. And but that album just kind of took me in a different place.
It's like something had happened and there was more of that. There was more of that exposure and willingness to just be open. And maybe, I don't know, maybe it was the earthiness of Brazil and being there for a while and living there. I don't know. Obviously, I don't know. But there was a flavour to that record that the ones that immediately preceded it didn't have. There was just an airiness and earthiness at the same time, and just an honesty that was very infectious. That record, I still play that record all the time.
You know, it's like it's an entire piece of work. It's not just a few songs put together. I thought, well, that's how I interpret it anyway. You know, I mean, maybe it's just to do with the period of time that it was released in, or something like that. That just made it kind of like made the hairs on my back of my neck stand up when I heard that LP. It was like, wow, brilliant.
I go when no man before me bothered to go, till the soles of my shoes are shot full of holes, and it's all downhill with a bullet. This rambling and roving is taking its course. I'm grazing with the dinosaurs and the dear old horses, and the city streets crack and a great hole forces me down. My soapbox, my pulpit, the theater ceiling, the silver star spangled, and the coins in my pocket go jingle.